Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good evening.
How's everybody doing? Good evening. Right. Good. Yeah, evening for Tim, early morning for Alaman. And mid-morning for
Good morning. Folks, I just want to let you know, I just jumped in to see where you're at because I didn't read the Myth America thing. So are you going to move on? When, if so, what are you going to read and all that? Or do you know yet?
We don't really know yet. So shall we talk about that first, since you brought it up? What do we want to read next?
I will mention there was some reasonable response to Simon Winchester's new book, Knowing What We Know, which comes out in 3 days. I ordered a copy earlier, like a month or so ago, or pre-ordered it. So, but that comes out on the 25th, I think.
Okay.
Maybe the 23rd. Sometime.
25th, according to your previous notes.
All right. Knowing What We Know, the transmission of knowledge from ancient wisdom to modern magic. Let's see if I can see
That sounds interesting.
It does.
And it wasn't framed as such, but one of his prior books, and I love his writing style because he's very good at doing linear presentations of not necessarily linear topics, which many within the Zettelkasten world always worry is a thing.
Is a thing that's
but he wrote The Professor and the Madman about the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary,
right,
which was done by collecting slips of paper in pigeonholes. So super old school Zettelkasten method there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so about 380 pages of text, it looks like. 6 chapters. Sure, this looks interesting.
I don't know. I won't try to oversell it, but there's a ton of stuff on our list that really looks good. So
yeah,
I'm game for it.
I was thinking actually that it might be a good idea to go back to a kind of reading or knowledge management text again, and sort of revisit that and sort of bounce back and forth between
as we seem to have had pirates in a short form, and this one was relatively quick read, partly because we've skipped a couple of chapters, and because each chapter is different author combo, and although it's in the same ring of subject, they're all quite tight in their own field to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered whether we wanted something to show a possible solution to some of our earlier problems and discussions on the economic side, as in Woolworth's donuts, or the donut economics, as being something that's slightly older, as in it's been around, it's in paperback as well, and all the rest of it. And so there'll be plenty of other discussions already had, whereas a book that hasn't actually come out yet, not all of us might be able to get it quite quick enough. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Do we think we could get through Rita's in 3 or 4 sittings at most?
Could get through what in 3 or 4 sittings?
The donut economics from whatever her name was now, I forgot.
Oh, okay. Let's look.
Of which Chris voted for anyway.
Yeah.
Kate Raworth.
Okay.
Must admit, I've forgotten how many
Donut
pages
economics,
it is.
yeah.
If we
Kate
know.
Raworth. Let's look at that. Let's look at that. If can we
Does
do that?
Amazon tell me.
Let's see what the
Yeah, 380 pages.
The general gist of Rayworth's book is economics was presented in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as an academic discipline that held a much more clockwork universe perspective and didn't get into any additional complexities and didn't include major components like the earth or the environment as part of a system that was kind of enclosed. So by looking at it purely as inputs and outputs, we've kind of framed our world in a, I've actually got a chapter or two into it, and it's a fascinating kind of reframing of economics in a much more interesting and complex method. In fact, I think I may have even been the one who put it on the list originally.
okay. I would be. It looks like that one is 7 chapters and an appendix, so it runs to about 300 pages. If we took it a couple of chapters at a time, we would get through it in a month. And
I was thinking on it, given that I proposed it anyway at one point, and Chris give me a quick thumbs up with it. My concern or my like for it was that it seems to offer a solution to all the previous economic stuff we've spoken about, which has all been very GDP type things driven.
mm-hmm.
And I think in as much as, say, Raber and Wengrow gave us a alternate history process in the dawn of everything, I think Kate here would give us a different mechanism for looking at numbers. It was just a thought, and because I don't think it's going to be quite so numerically number crunching as the one about America doesn't understand the poor or worst about effect title. It's a slightly wider perspective book as well. Although Winchester's one would be just as wide, if not wider, I suppose. But everything else has been very, with Piketty being the exception, I suppose, in those that are not note-making driven. Everything has been particularly American focused. Otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah, the economics book sounds great. As far as knowledge management, I mean, what would be a comparison? I mean, what would be a new book that would be of interest? I just don't know of anything you can propose. I mean, maybe you can. What can be proposed as an alternative? The economics book sounds great.
Yeah, I like the donut economics for the next read. I do kind of like this. You know, I'm sort of scrolling through the stuff that I can see on the preview that Amazon gives, and this knowing what we know does look interesting. I was thinking this summer I might want to read because I've never actually read Adler from cover to cover, and really tried to kind of work through that. And think about it. But
you are mentioning the How to Read a Book Adler and not the great books of the Western world Adler, right?
No, yeah, not read the whole. I have some of the great books. that shelf there. My dad was a big proponent of the Great Books system, but yeah, the How to Read volume. But I do kind of I think that this Knowing What We Know looks really interesting. So why don't we defer a decision or table a decision on that and say that Donut Economics will be next. Now that leaves us with the question of, are we going to finish Myth America today? Because as I was listening to these chapters, and kind of looking at them and making notes on them, it occurred to me that they are very different from each other. So it's not like we have just kind of one theme that all of the chapters sort of point to talk about today. On that front, the one that seemed really, really challenging to me was surprisingly, was the insurrection one, because I was not aware of some of the stuff that was talked about in it, and I thought, oh, I gotta go find this crazy volume that she's talking about that everybody.
Yeah, that was a good chapter.
The Turner Diaries, I had never actually even heard of. And I was like, well, Timothy McVeigh read this?
Oddly, outside of proper historical reference, chapter 17, my introduction to it was yet again that infamous communist TV series, The West Wing. There are 4 or 5 instances where the in-house Secret Service team talk about, amongst other things, the lone wolf and how that mechanism works.
Mm-hmm.
They don't mention the Turner Diaries, I think, explicitly, but they talk about elements of how do the sort of the Aryan front straight white supremacists all have their mechanisms for transferring information, instructions without actually saying things. The bit that I didn't know explicitly was where she then walks through how some of the early 70s and 80s money that they all stole from various bank heists and whatever went into Apple computers, so you could actually network the things together.
Yeah.
So here's another plus for Bill Gates and another thumbs down for Steve Jobs. But the
yeah,
in the middle of that, there's a quote that I've highlighted that is something along the lines of, "For this reason, we still read stories of lone wolf with gunmen attacking Muslims, Jews, Black Bible groups, etc., etc., etc." And that's like the last 2 or 3 years. It's not back when all this seemed to start, when you join chapter whatever it was, 17.
Yeah.
With chapter 20, and they talk about what can we do about getting rid of the 15th, 14th, and 17th Amendments.
Right.
That all joins up a bit with the more violent let's change this local condition, which is a good definition of gerrymandering and voter fraud. The one question I was going to ask, because I haven't really been paying attention to it other than I noticed a couple, was obviously with your last election, not the midterm, but the last election, there was all these claims through the Trump side, but the only ones I saw that where there were multiple cases or multiple votes, as in 5 or more, being juiced up by one person, they were all Republicans. And every time there was a finger pointed at a Democrat, it was always a single person. And most of the one that I saw with any detail was the person made a mistake and they were
Hi, Judy.
a parole serving felon or something, and therefore weren't allowed to vote. They didn't realize because they weren't in prison or something, they could vote because they were still on parole or something.
Mhm.
So it was a technicality as opposed to a clear conspiracy to gain multiple votes other than she voted when she shouldn't, as opposed to I did it 25 times to make sure, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But so has there been for the last your gubernatorial have there been any actual cases with Democrats being pulled up for 5+ per person? Or is it all just 1/2 maybe at worst?
I don't think that there's been any. I really don't think that there has been a lot of kind of well documented information that became mainstream enough. That there was significant. That there really was a lot going on. That's not. I mean, the sense that I get is more that that our issues are typically about under the guise of claiming that there's voter fraud going on, attempts to restrict access to the polls. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting in this, and probably applies to the voter fraud section as well, in this insurrection chapter, this idea of leaderless resistance, right? That that people can organize, in this way. I mean, this is not really anything new. This is the way cell-based resistance movements have kind of worked throughout history, right? That that people should be able to to protect the revolutionary organization by by limiting the amount of information that any individual has about who's doing things. It also strikes me that that it's again the George Carlin oft quoted George Carlin idea about how when there's a convergence of interests and agendas, you don't necessarily have to plan. One of the things that I thought was kind of missing, and I'm curious about what you thought, was this especially in the insurrection chapter, an assessment of why so many people, especially once she starts talking about this ring beyond the outer ring, right? Which was kind of implicated in the January 6th event that they're calling insurrection. That there are these people who are not subscribers to white supremacist publications and wouldn't read them if they read the headline, wouldn't be attracted by the headlines, but yet can be, I think the way she kind of framed it, can be seduced by some of these ideas. I don't know if anybody noticed, there was in my YouTube feed, there was a bad edit of about a 17-minute long 1950s sort of anti-fascist propaganda piece that was in black and white, about a guy who is a guy in the 50s is up on a he's speaking. He's up on a platform and he's speaking, and he's, you know, and he's kind of spouting these, you know, sort of racist and you know, and kind of fascist tropes, but, you know, saying, you know, I'm an American and I'm for America for Americans, and yada yada yada. And then he starts calling out, the bad, you know, the bad people, you know, he calls out, you know, the blacks. And then you know, it says we got to do something about them. And then he calls out, you know, the Jews. And then he calls out and there's this guy, and the camera sort of goes to this guy in the crowd who's sort of a younger guy, you know, dressed like a junior businessman type. And he's, of course, everybody dressed like that and wore a hat in the 50s. But he's sort of nodding, and he's like, and then, you know, and then he gets it, you know, and then he gets on, he says, and the Freemasons, we got to do something about the Freemasons. And the guy's like, oh, that's me. He's talking about me. And he sort of turns away and says, this guy's, you know, he sort of mutters, this guy's nuts. And this old, you know, Hungarian guy next to him says, you seem upset. And he says, well, yeah, this guy's, you know, I'm not anti-American. And he says, but you were kind of going for it. You were kind of nodding and going along with, you know, the other things. He says, yeah, but he was talking about, you know. And then, you know, and then this Hungarian guy goes into this whole story about how he was in Berlin in the 30s and he saw this, and you know, and tells this whole story about, you know, how if only the people who heard, you know, the Nazi, you know, speaker in the 30s in Berlin would have said, when they started, you know, dividing people, would have said, no, wait a minute, that's BS. So yeah, it is kind of a first they came sort of a story. It struck me though that, I guess, and the reason I bring it up is that there seems to be a lack of interest in this insurrection, and with the, you know, and I guess maybe with, you know, her, from her perspective, you know, knowing about kind of what she knows about and the Turner Diaries and all that, you know, kind of providing this underpinning and this you know, this apparently really nasty story. I'm gonna have to look into it. That it's obvious to her, you know, that there is an anti-American, there is a you know, a group of people who since the 80s have been at war with America, as, you know, as even mainstream Americans have understood it. I've talked a long time now, and I was trying to begin this with a question. What do you think about that idea that everybody is there for that reason, and that there isn't something else going on in this, you know, in this sense of, I mean, I kind of feel like it's a sense of feeling left behind by mainstream politics.
Well, there's also kind of, I think, broad movements of militias, and we want to have a sense of freedom and how certain people define freedom, but there is a fringe of a small, you know, it's larger than 5%, probably not much larger than 15%, but it's the super far right base of the don't tread on me kind of stripe and variety that has been super marginalized for decades. Typically they're, at least based on reporting I've seen, it's a lot of it rose out of people coming back from Vietnam in the 70s and being marginalized and not valorized the way we had valorized other people who had fought in prior wars. And in a space where it's more likely you turn to drugs and alcohol or have issues, and then you don't get any support. So that became a huge space for recruiting. And there's a huge recruitment space even in, you know, law enforcement. We, you know,
Right.
every 6 months somebody comes out and it's like, oh, these law enforcement members were part of this super far right group. And it, people get up in arms for a minute and a half, and we kind of sweep it under the rug as a broader society. It's not something you see in the news often, but it's there.
Right.
And I think Trump gave voice to this group of people to help push them together. So things like, the Turner Diaries comes out in the late 70s. I think it's part of that narrative of here's someone who's helping give voice in an available thing. Because prior to that, it was all mimeographs and photocopies or person to person,
Right.
or small things like the little clues that get passed along that mainstream America, most people probably don't know what the number 1488 means. But if you know what 1488 means, the chances that you have read the Turner Diaries increases by a magnitude and then some.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And all of it's it's not too unsafe, but I'll leave it to people to Google what 1488 means. I would say stick to adl.com as your source to not go too far astray. But those things happen, or we have quirky weird things that even the news kind of so heavily marginalizes them. The Waco, Texas
Right.
groups, or the Mormon compounds that get raided, and they're taking over our way of life, and we want to do and maybe it's a way of life that you could have done in early 1800s America and gotten away with, but you still have to live in a bigger society.
Yeah.
In fact, I was looking at things like, I don't know if you wrote that, was your Shays Rebellion piece, was that a recent thing because of this, or did that just happen to pop up in class and overlap with?
I like Shays Rebellion. That's been kind of that's, and I do think that there is it's kind of funny because when they talk about that, they actually use when people like the guys who were writing to several people like Knox and Lincoln, the generals from the Revolutionary War, write to Washington and tell them the stories of Shays Rebellion, and they use words like agrarian justice, right? That's what these people are looking for, and so there's this whole idea, that and they understand what that term means in that context, and so and that it's something to be avoided, right? That America doesn't want, to devolve into agrarian justice, which also kind of strikes me as interesting and weird. But I do feel a little bit uncomfortable with this idea that seems in this chapter to be kind of just sort of saying, well, Donald Trump can be explained by this white power movement, and that somehow Donald Trump equals white power equals Donald Trump, which I think is probably, and that's I think really, the antidote to that is, the type of analysis that like Thomas Frank did about, sort of populists on both sides, the people know, right? Where he kind of finds, not necessarily common ground between white supremacists and, and populists on the left, Bernie or people to the left of Bernie, but that there is a sense that that the center is failing to, to sort of represent. So I posted it was called "Don't Be a Sucker" was the YouTube video that I saw, and it looked like it was from the 50s. I didn't actually check the original kind of provenance of it. Pat, we're looking at, we're still fighting the Civil War. Yeah, I think, probably kind of in large part. It's funny, we had sort of the last pre-Civil War chapter of my, kind of the impending crisis chapter of my my primary source text that I worked with my students on this week, and it was, and we did, and then we're kind of getting ready to wrap up because Tuesday will be the last class for them, and so thinking about, I was trying to get to this. Well, what is it that what's the legacy of that, and this, who's America for, which I think is also part of that, sort of the ultimate meaning of the it was actually 43, so it's earlier than I thought it was. Thank you, Chris.
Well, the other thing that I
Go ahead, Tim.
find strange in the same conversation, sorry, is you get these various lefty comedians go to Trump rallies to see how many people can actually pick out North Korea rather than let's bomb Canada type questions. And there was one, probably the last but one I happened to drift over, was talking about the whole of the Russia versus Ukraine is fake because it's not been on the channel she watches. So, and it then comes over as being a bit like when Ricky Gervais talks to the guy who's on that evening talk show. Can't remember what his name is now.
Here's Morgan.
Oh, Stephen Colbert.
Oh God,
and he's saying, why is he an atheist? It's like, you believe in one God, albeit in three bodies, and there's like 3,000 gods. So you disbelieve 2,999.
Right.
And Ricky just disbelieves one more.
One additional one, yeah. I don't think that formulation.
And it's like, if you, how do you get to the position that ignore the stupidity meme of why are you reading all those books when this one's got all the answers? So you've got one person reading the Bible and the other one, it's got a stack of 25 science textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Forget that for a minute. How do you walk around the world as it is today, and you are in America with all the channels coming through the cable? It's not like you've got those 3 or 4 channels that were in the 60s pre-cable, and decide that you've only got one, you only need one source of news.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even your local newspaper. It's a more. So I could well believe that the Rocky Mountain trumpet paper for the village 25 miles outside of Colorado doesn't talk about Ukraine versus Russia war that much, but it mentioned it in passing at some point, surely, sort of thing. But, and then, do you therefore believe that NBC, BBC, Reuters, and all the rest of it are there giving total and absolute bollocks? because that's what it would mean. It's like, it's literally, saying it's a religion, and I'm not going to do any comparative religious studies at all.
Hmm.
How do you get to that? Such that you feel that you could ignore what's in people's, 99.9% of the people's heads. It's akin to saying, as the big issue with Islam, they were clearly the defenders of knowledge and academia and science for our Western Dark Ages. And then I think it was somewhere around 1460, or was it 1660, Al-Ghazir decided he found the devil in mathematics and pulled the plug, effectively, such that stopped major Muslim Islamic progress. Now, are you really going to decide that you, of all people, have found a way of calculating Pythagoras ignores triangles or something, such that therefore you can decide that you can ignore everything that comes thereafter? Because that's what it accounts to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. Just when I think that the religion issue is sort of off the table, it kind of comes back. An example of that was, I guess this week, you've probably all seen more than enough about the MSNBC Mehdi Hassan versus Matt Taibbi event, and that has apparently, I'm not going to comment on that, but except to say that has apparently sort of resurrected a bunch of videos in my YouTube feed of Mehdi Hassan debating, and apparently Mehdi Hassan thinks of himself as the king of debaters, and apparently has written a book about it. But I was treated to. YouTube served me up a clip of Mehdi, might have been at the Oxford Union, debating Richard Dawkins, and so once again, it was just a reminder for me that that oftentimes these types of disagreements and the way that these disagreements are being done resemble that type of religious argument to a much greater extent. It's an argument about that kind of takes on that sort of terminology and that sort of mental space, and then
but you teach debate. Particularly, I mean, we don't quite have the same level of debating societies as you seem to have. But the mechanism by which you teach it is both teams need to know both arguments, and then you win which one by a toss, and therefore you then argue that. So there is a element of the truth doesn't matter; it's who's got the biggest punch. In some respects, and there was
yes, and who's got the biggest ability in the moment to have to basically stick to their script and have have a path that they adhere to and don't get thrown off because they've anticipated the reaction or the counter argument. I think that there's a lot of debate success that comes from that. I would agree.
Well, and part of it is the idea too that both sides have the same shared context of what's going on, so that they can leave out huge chunks of what would otherwise be debate. And it almost always comes down to being just that, is what is your context?
No, NPR's podcast, The Hidden Brain, the latest one is literally that, and they use Mitt Romney's total forget of his 3 departments of government that he would remove if he gets in. He remembers the first 2, but can't remember the third. That's this week, this fortnight, however often it is, and it reminds me of I went to an Islamic Society grouping, a debate between some Greek guy who was a Muslim convert against a well-known scientist-type atheist. And this was held in University College London, which is just up the road from Euston Station.
Mhm.
And the well-known atheist said he would not attend if there was any sign of segregation within the crowd. And it turned out that this bunch of women friends all sat together. So he decided to call his get out of jail free card and attempt to say, no, I'm not going to do it because you've got segregation.
Mm.
And all 14 friends were in complete veils and abayas and black. Quite a few other people who were either ex-Muslims or non-Muslims said, no, they just happen to be friends. Everybody else is mixed, etc., etc. Anyway, so there was an element of, the usual 5 minutes for each party, and then 3.5 minutes rebuttal and
Right.
questions backwards and forwards. One of the questions from the crowd to the atheist was, so what about incest? To which point the scientist said, well, given the amount of contraception we have, incest is not a problem. At which point, all the Muslims did a big sucking the teeth sound. And I laughed because by this time, I was living here. And there are so few Emiratis that they often marry, like the royal families of Europe do, second cousins,
Sure.
and if not closer, in some cases, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a big suck in the teeth again because I'd laughed, and I then commented about, but it's quite common in the Arabic world, forget about being Muslim, given prior to coming here, half of the Arabs I knew were Christian anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And said basically what I've just said about. At which point, the atheist scientist laughed and continued with, but it's a bigger problem in the US because of particularly in certain areas, people don't mix around. And at that point, I almost thought that I would say about, okay, so how many Muslims here have got a non-Muslim wife or husband? And it's tough. It's a bit like back in the day, if you married a Catholic, and in a Catholic church,
Mm-hmm.
you had to promise that the kids would be brought up Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc. I mean, it just clearly worries me in the context of this, when we've spoken about similar things, not for this book per se, if I remember rightly, but it's been mentioned about the grouping or the style of group that talks about one drop of blood. Hence, Obama is black, not half white.
Mhm.
At least in their eyes.
Right. But yeah, but ironically not yeah, not African American in the sense of not descended from enslaved Africans, which was a little bit confusing for people as well. Mark, you had said something about debate. You had sort of defined debate in the chat. I'm wondering if the set of skills that are traditionally, or maybe I won't say were traditionally taught when people were learning debate, have they gone out of style? Are they what people think of nowadays? The things that you're sort of describing here.
Yeah, I had experience as a debater a long time ago, but from an educational perspective, maybe a couple of years ago, I became interested in the whole idea of teaching debate.
Yeah.
And there's several books, really good books, researchers who investigate that process. And I was just reacting. I think it was Tim who said, well, something about, well, you end up treating both sides as equal because, I mean, in some debate formats, you have to take on the position that's assigned to you. But I think that's completely different. And that was my point. Completely different than supposedly developing a value system and a skill set. It doesn't mean there's no right answer.
Right.
I mean, you may, but how do you pursue convincing? This is more about how do you potentially pursue convincing your opponent and others generally of what's the right position, and it argues that it's really about logic and taking what's your position, how do you support it, how do you counter someone else's position, do you really hear what they have to say? That's part of the skill set you develop, not just so much arguing. I mean, in analyzing discussions or argument, the word they often use is argumentation. That's the new phrase to report debate. It sounds negative to a lot of people because the word argument kind of sounds negative, but the logic is, well, what is a good argument? What is a good, and that's supposedly the debate approach. So that's what I was really commenting on.
Yeah. And that's what I'm curious about, because I have a colleague in the history program that I'm in who religiously uses a set of books that is kind of a debate set. It's called Taking Sides, right? And so so there are a series of issues that it poses, and it gives ironically, not often a primary source on each side, but usually, a historian's position essay on each side, and then asks the students to take one side or the other and kind of debate it. And I think part of that, as a pedagogical thing, I think is kind of legitimate, but I think it assumes a lot of work on the part of the debate teacher or the debate textbook or whatever to not, to not fall prey to sort of the things that are being, that people are falling prey to, especially in the media now, kind of false equivalency and that sort of thing, right? Forensics as well, right? How to which Judy, does that imply more kind of a organizing and presenting facts? Is there more of an assumption of facts there, or do they extend forensics to mean kind of logical arguments and things like that?
I think it seems like there's more research a focus on it rather than the extemporaneous type that, I remember seeing, in high school,
Mhm.
where it was more like you're not given that much time.
Right.
And so, the forensics that I see here now it's, like you said, it's more of a research focused.
Yeah.
Well, I remember doing that or having friends specifically who did debate in the early 90s in high school. And there it's had been, and I went to a high school that had a national championship team for several years
Cool.
in the middle of nowhere, Georgia. But there it was almost played as a game, and it was more about argumentation and style. So you could go find crazy quotes from Wayne LaPierre to make some statement.
Yeah.
And the goal was, as it was played more as a game than it was as a let's actually make some substantive debates on these things. So if you could go find crazy far right-wing sources that were not entertainingly for us, was all done on index cards. So you would take index cards and
Yeah.
take quotes and newspaper articles, and you would thumb through them so that you could find a quote that made an argument that your opponent didn't have in their Zettelkasten to be able to pull out their thing to reply to it. And if
Mhm.
they couldn't reply to it, then you got a point. And it became a game more so than it was a, hey, that's a respectable source or not a respectable source. So you could say that is such a far left wing or right wing loon source. They're not making an argument. Yes, that's a quote, but nobody ever made those arguments of. And I think we're in a world too now where I know in past books we have looked at the idea of information overload is a thing, and
Mhm.
it's more so a thing now than it was even in the Middle Ages. So how do you take two ideas and compare them? It's easy if they're on an index card. It's even easier if you've got all that appertaining context that goes behind those things to make judgments, and that's fine. But in a world where we're overwhelmed with daily information, and even worse in a social media environment where you know headline international news, something happening in Ukraine that is pivotal for where we are in the world is put at the same level as Joe Blow down the street lost his job last week or went crazy and killed somebody.
Mhm.
Those at a local level, the one story means something different than it does at the national level, but they're now put right next to each other. So you don't have the effect that we had in newspapers 20 years ago, where the headline news was, here's this thing, and that should take your attention. And then the article on page D17 doesn't mean as much. You need to filter through the paper to get there.
Right.
So we're missing the contextualization of where those things are.
Mhm. Well,
But we're also in a bigger world where we've lost the idea of what beyond the pale means. If
Mhm.
you're in a small city or a town with 200 or 300 people, being sent beyond the pale, which most people don't even know is kind of the delimitation of the town marker,
Mhm.
beyond which it's not safe to travel, or you might be set upon by brigands and die.
Right.
So if you're in a small town and you do something that's beyond the pale, they literally would eject you from society,
Mhm.
and you've got to go live out there where you're probably going to die.
Right.
But we're in a multi-ethnic, multinational, much bigger society. We don't, as humans, we don't know how to deal with that.
Mhm.
If you live in, I just went to small town Tennessee for a
Yeah,
week.
how was that?
While I was there, I visited the world's largest knife showroom, which was a fascinating experience. I mean, you take the largest Macy's you've ever been to in your life and double it.
Wow.
And that's what I mean. You like go into the men's section of your local Macy's department store, and they may have a a Tommy Hilfiger section.
Yeah.
This store had a Victorinox section that was larger than any Victorinox store you could ever imagine there
Wow.
being in existence.
Hmm.
And it was you know, several, it was, 1,000 square feet of space
Yeah.
in this massive, edifice. But, and it's built into an area. I was on the border of roughly the Tennessee, North Carolina border, just on the west side of the Smoky Mountains, within driving distance of Dollywood. So it's a major tourist destination, which is why this knife showroom is there. Is while you go on your vacation to the Smoky Mountains or go to Dollywood, you're going to stop here.
Right.
And you're going to visit one of the multiple distilleries or moonshine places to taste moonshine. Or I think their strip had, at least 10 gun showroom stores as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what passes as, Southern culture and identity. When you go on vacation, this is what you're doing. And I'm super, and Gatlinburg's not very far away either. So it's, you live in the South, this is where you go the same way I might go to Disneyland in Southern California.
Yeah.
But what do you do besides Disneyland while you're in Southern California? Maybe you go to the beach or you do something like that. But here it's very clear what the thing is in the identity. And I was almost kind of depressed walking in to this big knife showroom. A family walked in front of me, all overweight. Half of them didn't want to be there, but dad was like, hey, this is our Saturday afternoon. We're going to spend 4 hours at this. And you could easily spend 3 days there and not see all the
knife museum.
It would, just insane. I probably should post some photos of it, but
Wow.
The family was dragged and most of them didn't want to be there and they weren't having fun, but we're going to be here.
Yeah.
And not a Swiss Army knife in view.
Yeah. I don't know. That takes us far afield. I wanted to get back to, so, we originally had Cicero and Quintilian and rhetoric was a thing and it was taught and pushed through.
Right.
And then in, I don't know, what's the 5th century, it gets tied up and the Catholic Church kind of picks up Neoplatonism and the old wisdom of the ancients. So it's now not just Jesus and the apostles, but it's now church fathers melded with ancient Greece, which then spins off scholasticism for, several centuries.
Right.
And I think I posted a few minutes ago the Carol Sayers essay from I think it was a lecture from 1948 that got published. But that now is the backbone to a large extent for homeschoolers who are learning these ideas of rhetoric and argumentation, but they're also heavily melded still with that old idea of the Catholic Church or religion, and this is how it should be done. So we're still kind of, it's the worst Reese's peanut butter cup. We're taking the peanut butter and the chocolate, and in that case, they taste good together and there's something interesting. But I think for our culture and society, taking that religion and that argumentation and melding them together isn't always, necessarily the best idea, even if you take those philosophies. But it's even harder when you're doing it in a multicultural world that may see the argumentation side or the older rhetoric, and they can separate that from the religion piece. And I think in a lot of our political discourse, people are not able to remove their religious beliefs from their political space and their argument of, hey, science says this is the better way to go.
Right.
But what happens when your religion and your identity and beliefs are morally opposed to that thing?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you go? How do you do that?
Yeah.
And we don't know how to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier in a smaller 200 person little city where you can eject somebody out beyond the pale. And in modern society, you go beyond that pale and you're in the next city over and nobody knows you.
Yeah.
It's a whole new space. So you can, you could be a serial killer in the 1800s and move city to city,
Mm-hmm.
and your information trail doesn't follow you. So you can continue operating. Nobody notices. It's
Mm-hmm.
much harder now in a surveillance capitalistic society to do that, because if nothing else, your credit score is going to follow you everywhere.
Right.
And it's harder to change your name and your identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we don't
wonder-
have tools.
I wonder if, as simultaneously, we're having and it's passed now, but I want to comment on it. A few minutes ago, there was a chat thread about ChatGPT, and I think that is kind of interesting. It interests what you're saying, kind of in comparison with that, Chris. Kind of interests me. This idea, an idea that maybe ChatGPT just sort of automates what people are doing anyway. In the sense that it's going on, because the comments in ChatGPT were, wouldn't be any worse than Fox News. In a sense, the aggregation of, and I've only used the 3.0 or the 3.5, whatever it was that is out there that you don't have to pay for. And I think I haven't had access to the 4.0, which has the more recent data from the, from kind of the pandemic era. So I imagine there's more opportunity, just if it's going, if what it's pulling and kind of scraping out of the web to fill its knowledge base is somehow not reflective of reality, but it sees it, and it sees it amplified and reinforced and and repeated and repeated and repeated. Stuff that we would call, misinformation or disinformation or even malinformation, right? How do that we're now, I think, alarmed that maybe ChatGPT is going to hallucinate, right, and is going to base its ideas about what's true on this false information. How is that any different? I mean, that's just a sort of an automation. I mean, maybe because it seems more authoritative than individuals doing that. But we certainly have individuals who have a lot of influence on public opinion who are already doing that.
So to me, this debate that everybody is having about ChatGPT is being horribly misframed, because we all have an idea in our heads of what artificial intelligence should be,
mm-hmm.
and what the result of that should look like, particularly when we wear the rose-colored glasses of the technologists of the last half century. Mm-hmm. Life is going to be better, gosh darn it, and technology is going to make it. Even Whirlpool ads from the 50s, my dishwasher and my washing machine are going to make life better. And
mm-hmm.
Epcot Center in Florida is like ground zero for that philosophy.
Yeah.
But what Chat GPT is really doing is it's giving you something that sounds like what a plausible answer could be, but is wholly not that. So if you consider, I don't know, a decade, 2 decades ago when cell phones first came out, and you had to type on your 9-button phone to try and get text, so you would hit, the number 1 twice to get the letter B. Well, there was a thing called T9 predictive text.
Oh, yeah, I
And
remember that.
it's a simple thing that's part of almost every language, that as you start texting, the realm of possibility of what word you're typing gets smaller and smaller.
Mhm.
So you can do predictive text, and that T9 in your cell phone was like essentially level 1 of what this is. And Chat GPT is just the next iteration of that predictive text. But instead of doing it at the word level, it's now doing it at the sentence or the paragraph level. And shortly it'll do it at the book level. But the problem, almost everybody who's used that predictive text on a phone knows, you can just choose the next word that the machine tells you, and you'll come up with some kind of sentence, but it's going to be probably gibberish. But if you have a large enough body of words behind it, the less likely it's going to look like gibberish, and the more likely it'll look like something. Which is why GPT is going to hallucinate and have these issues.
Mhm.
And everybody who looks at it is looking at it through those Epcot Center rose-colored glasses, and we're so far from that. Just silly.
Yeah.
To the point that the average person doesn't realize it's the repetitive, structured nature of the English language that allows the idea of a crossword puzzle to exist.
Mhm.
It's mathematically, crossword puzzles exist because of the structure of the language and who we are and how we speak.
Mhm.
And there's enough repetition in the words that you can overlay a whole bunch of different words and come up with something that's going to fill all the boxes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's
and then
interesting. Yeah. It's interesting that people, for the most part, it doesn't occur to them that the language model doesn't understand the responses that it's giving. It's just
and nowhere close.
It's just basically, it's just stochastic, right?
And if it's you to start typing into Google, and Google is going to intuit that you're searching for, when you type in Britney Spears, you're going to get a list of like 5 things,
Right.
Net worth, who's her husband, something else. In fact, almost invariably, if you put in any public woman's or someone who's famous in the public eye, a woman's name, the next word that Google is going to suggest to you is husband. Because socially and culturally, we all want to know who that woman is married to. Now,
Right.
you do the same thing with a man and you don't have that same pattern. And that's a massive bias that we as a culture have. And Google sadly plays into that bias to provide us with, and then reinforces that as part of that. So even if you weren't interested in who Sonia Sotomayor's husband was, you're going to get that answer, or it's
Right.
going to pop up and you're going to be like, oh, now I'm curious. What the hell was that?
Right.
Not what was her decision on the Supreme Court last week? What was her argument? Which is maybe what you came for.
Right.
But now suddenly you're Harry and Mary beer can.
It's like BuzzFeed. Yeah.
But Google
Which is not
search,
BuzzFeed anymore.
Right.
Google search, give it its credit, is only looking for the most recent best answer that everybody else has been looking for. Whereas ChatGPT, if you ask, as I've commented a couple of times, you ask for the top 5 papers by some historian called Dan Lasso, and then you go and ask Dan, did you write these? 2 of them, he's likely to say no. because ChatGPT doesn't hallucinate, it lies. And when you go back and ask it, can you say who has cited those 5 papers? It still answers that question as though it didn't lie to start with. And then if you point it out it was lying, it apologizes profusely and comes up with a different answer, right? Whereas Google is not providing you with an answer. It's providing you with a statistical, what was the next piece of information? As you say, if you type in Britney Spears, the likelihood of the next piece of information out is her husband's name. Or the fact that my mates took a photograph of the stuff that was in her bedroom and got told to delete his phone because it's not what you do when you run a hotel. But, you know, so the bringing it back, I think, in terms of this, how do people hold up without being otherwise determined, medically determined as being a complete nutcase, that NASA never went to the moon and white Protestants should rule the world? You look at some of the stuff that was coming out of Reinhard Heydrich's office when he was the ruler of Bohemia. The education policy that the Czechs that had sided with the Germans was that the normal Czech, because they weren't quite Slavs but they weren't quite Aryan, only needed to be educated such that he could sign his name and count to 50. And the girls didn't need education at all. Just the boys. And for the whole of the Bohemia, they probably only needed to educate 5,000 boys a year because it wasn't economic to do any more than that. Right? So if that was what the Aryan-driven mythology had come up with, how is it that I need to educate the American Catholics, Italians, Irish, blacks, browns, pinks, yellow, whatever colour you want to pick, that's not a clear white supremacist Protestant? You know, where's it all joined through? What's the basis?
I'm not sure. I didn't follow that train of thought, I don't think.
Well, we haven't read Turner's diary, but that's part of a problem, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's sort of, I mean, it's sort of like saying that, that the whatever it was, whatever his little dissertation or his what's his name, Cecil Rhodes's thing that he wrote about how the white race, how Brits are the most civilized people in the world, and the more, the bigger part of the world that they inhabit, the better. It is, it's alarming when you read it today. At the time, I guess he had, he only spent a year at Oxford, right, before he went back to South Africa, but he did go to Ruskin's lecture on, the responsibility of the English people to conquering the world, and kind of and absorb that whole sort of white man's burden argument. That's one of the things that I guess I'm sort of interested in. That's what, when Mark was talking about sort of the rhetorical mechanics of argumentation, that interests me a lot. These are when you read some of these things, they are very erudite, right? And they are very, and they're supported by classical quotation and, and kind of these sort of hand waving references to, to canons and traditions of, of Western Europe and all that kind of stuff. And then they sort of go off the rails and say something absurd and, really unconscionable and get away with it. And so so sort of my question is, how does that happen? Is it because, how much does the attractiveness of the package contribute to selling that horrible idea, right? Or is it just, is it just because it gives people an excuse to think what they wanted to think anyway? Or what's going on there?
Well, in addition to the mechanics of this, the other part, I think, of understanding some of the issues is
You locked up.
biases, right? All the
You locked up there for a sec, Mark. Can you back up about 15 seconds?
yeah, I said, the cognitive psychology listing all the particular biases that we can somehow call into play, which unfortunately kind of makes the whole thing seem hopeless at some level. And in fact, the combination of bias and skill in executing some of these arguments is probably a deadly combination.
Well, it's even if you go back and look at it, even from the religion side, it wasn't until roughly, 1800s Germany that religious scholars started to look at ideas of how do you treat the Bible as history? How much is true? How much is not true? What is supported by archaeology? What is not?
Mm-hmm.
How do you tease apart the idea of, there's a whole space about the historical Jesus. What do we know about him? What contemporaneous accounts are there? And you can go back and look at, there's only, I think, only 2 mentions of Jesus outside of the Bible from roughly contemporaneous history to that point.
Was Josephus, right?
Yeah, so Josephus is one of them.
Yeah.
But he's also a Jew writing for a radically different audience. And even the audience he's writing for is probably tempering what he's writing, and it's not necessarily his own specific, context that he would have written if he were writing to his brother or sister, let's say.
Yeah.
So you can look at that, and it becomes more apparent that Christianity is a religion about Jesus and not the religion of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And now you look at modern politics and the people who swing it as their bludgeon of choice. Jesus had really two kind of big ideas, but he distilled Judaism down into kind of the golden rule is the one big one.
Right.
And every politician who says they're a Christian doesn't even get that one right.
Right.
They're
Old Testament Christians.
99 times out of 100, the one message that he had, they miss. Yeah. And they miss it every time. Yeah. But if, and I'll go to, let's say, you go to Starbucks, and I very frequently will see or hear 2 people, they've got a Bible in front of them, and they're talking about the Bible and what it means to them today. Mm-hmm. And they are totally decontextualizing it from 1st century AD. In fact, actually, it's not even that, because pretty much everything in the Bible was written 60 to almost 200 years after Jesus died
Right.
in a roughly non-literate society. So
Right.
that'd be like saying,
And then
how do-
canonized in the 4th century.
okay, so it's roughly the equivalent of what a third grader has as presumptions about who George Washington is, but presume the third grader can't read and doesn't have access to any primary source documents. How do you recreate that life through several generations of oral tradition in a place where oral tradition is not the oral tradition of indigenous societies, the way it had been practiced for millennia outside that?
Mhm.
But they'll talk about what this Bible passage means for them right now. And it's patently clear to me that they are not taking any context of any semblance of what that passage meant to those people in that time. And they're, because we like quoting passages about or from the West Wing, there's the scene where Bartlett comes in and takes to task the far right woman who's a psychologist. She's not even a psychologist. She calls herself a doctor, and he's talking about putting his daughters up for sale, or should he kill the football team because they touch a pigskin on the weekend? Just really crazy things
Mhm.
that in those original contexts, that's what they would have done.
Right.
But we live in a society that has moved on from that and has a massively different set of norms, yet still somehow
Chris,
we're taking
Chris,
those.
you've been watching The West Wing again.
I'll give you even more fun. So I think one of the writers and producers of The West Wing has a new Netflix show called The Diplomat with Kerry Russell.
Oh, I
And
saw that. Yeah.
And the general gist of it, the thing that I find super fascinating is it's obviously it's focused more on foreign relations and the situations Kerry Russell as the ambassador to London or to England is faced with are very black and white in terms of US geopolitics. And it's fairly hard for anyone to have major issues except for, do we really need to be projecting as much power as we are? But that aside, it's all very black and white, the situation she's in, and they're putting her up as a potential future presidential candidate who can just kind of do the job and do it logically without worrying about, am I doing it to give myself more power, which is the polar opposite of Trump's reason for being president. I just want to be in control, and you're going to do what I say rather than, doing what I do.
Yeah.
But there's no discussion of any identity politics whatsoever for this future presidential candidate, which I find stunningly fascinating. It's like, oh, she can do a job, but is that what we want in our leaders? Do we want a leader who looks like us, sounds like us, takes us in a moral or specific direction? And that this show totally divorces those kind of ideas of, there's a morality to who she is and what she's doing. And she looks and sounds like us, but I don't know if everybody's going to read it that same way.
I thought the nice thing about the touching the pigskin on Saturday and Sunday, and the similar things that all got pinched by Sorkin from somebody doing a radio call-in show where they accused the radio host of being a complete Leviticus buff. And that was just reproduced where Jed Bartlett had got a crisis of confidence. And he rips this chat show host to pieces using almost word for word what this person had said, and chapter 20 we did Voterful, right?
Well, we kind of did. We kind of said the words, but did we really talk about it? Or I mean, so okay. Since I just derailed you there, Tim, let's talk about this briefly, because I think there are some. I mean, are there more things to say? I mean, it seemed like insurrection and voter fraud kind of went together, and the family values and the Reagan Revolution kind of went together. Or have we just, have we said all we want to say about this? I think that the family values one was interesting, just in the term, in the sense of narrative as well. But what do people want to do for next week before Mark has to go?
I've got nothing more to say really on Voterful, because it all revolved around, you've got 3 or 4 of your Loch Ness Monster issues.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Pat also
amendments.
votes for starting the new one. Okay, shall we then, jumping over to Donut, the table of contents there. I got it up on my other screen. The first chapter is called Change the Goal, and the second chapter is called See the Big Picture, and together they account for about 90 pages. Do we want to do that much, or should we just do the first chapter, the intro in the first chapter for next week? That would be about 60 pages.
Intro in one at least.
Intro in one. We have a motion.
Yep. And that may be a better option too, if people don't yet have a book in hand.
Okay. Looks like we've got intro and one for next week. Then who wants to be an economist and change the goal? I was scrolling through I was just kind of quickly scrolling through the intro, and it did look interesting. It had some graphics, it had some narrative in it, some backstory.
What's the name of the book?
It's called what is it called? Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. Is that how you pronounce it? Is it a long A? I don't know. I've never seen her anywhere. The John Maynard Keynes of the 21st century, says George Monbiot, who I think just has recently gone on record as being a nut in The Guardian, but I used to like him. All right, so are we out of time? Shall we call it now, or anybody have anything else they want to say about these last chapters that we kind of ran through here? I thought the family values versus feminism was kind of the way I thought of that chapter was interesting. I thought the narrative was good, but I thought, again, sort of in the sense of this sort of rhetorical tricks theme that we've been going on. There's a paragraph that she cites a source at the end of on page like 315 about Sanger and eugenics, which sort of debunks the idea. She says everybody thinks that everybody uses eugenics to sort of attack Sanger, and she's arguing against that, and she has this one, and she has a citation that basically just doesn't really prove her argument or even give evidence to her argument, but cites an article by Herman Cain in Dissent, which strikes me as challenging, but she probably got away with it because probably nobody looked at nobody ever looks at the citation, and the fact that there's a footnote at the end of that paragraph probably suggests to people that she's got some data behind her claim.
Yeah. Or it's the kind of, there's a curtain over there and there's stuff behind it, but you don't need to go look because the citation is enough.
Mhm.
But I actually marked that one because it was a Herman Cain reference, and I haven't had time to dig it up yet, and I was kind of curious, but just the fact that Herman Cain came up there was like, okay, one should dig into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I did too, is I sort of highlighted it and said, I need to go back to this and look at what did, W.E.B. Du Bois and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. actually say. And Mary, and Mary McLeod Bethune and Ida B. Wells.
Well, those debates too about family values, and we all say these things like they mean something.
Mm-hmm.
And we broadly over the span of the last 500 years have moved from, small city neighborhood, very clannish and extended family setups
Mm-hmm.
to now super ultra nuclear families that are 3 or 4 people and don't go beyond 2 generations. So
Right.
it's very rare in America. You'll have a grandmother and a grandfather, but do you necessarily live near them? Are they part of your life?
Right.
And over the last 500 years, which is broadly the thesis behind that book, The Weirdest People in the World, we have gone from these extended familial relationships and even things like the politics of Tammany Hall, and you got to look out for your family or extended family, your neighborhood, your brother,
Right.
within the society. We don't do that anymore. And as a result of that, it means we also need to trust other people more, even more so in a space where we can't know all the things, but too many of our politicians are in it for themselves or for some other thing, so they're willing to take on ideologies they don't believe in at all to garner votes.
Mm-hmm.
But then they don't want to do the work to dig in to even the second or third level. And it's literally, it's gotten so bad now. I think the biggest problem with Trump is he's willing to say something he doesn't believe himself as a means of getting people to rally around or froth at the mouth.
Right.
I don't think he cares at all about the Supreme Court, but that was, hey, I'll say this and I'll do this one thing because it's going to be the thing that keeps me in power.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he has the ability to see the first level, much less 2 levels of complexity beyond the thing he's doing now, other than, does it put money in my pocket and keep me in power?
Right.
Literally, he doesn't have that ability. I don't think he has that level of thought or capability of thought. He really doesn't.
How much of the neighborhood do you think, as a slight aside to that, is we don't need to talk to each other? We don't walk down the road to the shop at about the same time. We don't walk to the train station or the bus station in a big way, versus probably a myth that you saw about the town community, say, as displayed by the Waltons on television. I mean, here is terrible because you can't easily walk outside of your immediate community that is maybe 1,000, 2,000 dwellings.
Right.
Because the main roads cut you off just as badly as they do as in many Canadian and US cities.
Yeah.
And more so, you've got a language barrier.
Yeah.
So,
I think that kind of, having a homogeneous community in these neighborhoods. I'm thinking I guess that my see you later, Judy. My experience is like neighborhoods in Boston, and when I was growing up, I didn't live in Boston, but we used to go to the north end of Boston, which was the Italian community, and there would be, I remember and it was probably ending in the 60s and the 70s, but there were still, grandmothers in black, who would be, kind of hanging out the upstairs windows, as you would walk in the north end from there, kind of looking out the windows, elbows on the sill, and sort of sometimes chatting across the street or the alley, with other old ladies in the second floor window adjacent or across from them. But the thing that they used to do is they used to sort of enforce the social codes, right? So kids running around the streets, raising hell and stuff, they would scold them and they would say, what would your mother, say? And, and the implication was that this is going to get back to your mother, right?
Yeah. Or what would your grandmother say? Just as
right.
easy.
What would your grandma? Yeah, it's going to get back to the mother by way of the grandmother, right? That these, that there's this kind of informal, network going on, and that is somehow, kind of. I mean, there was a very famous commercial that at least played in the Northeast. I don't know if anyone ever saw it, but it was for Prince Spaghetti, which was made in the north end of Boston. That's where the factory was. And there's this, and in the 60s. I remember there's this kid, he's running through the streets, and it's like that, and the old ladies are yelling at him, slow down, from the second story windows. But he's running through the streets, Anthony, and his name is Anthony. And Anthony always runs, Anthony runs through the streets, he runs home on Wednesdays. Why? Because Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day, right? And so he gets home and he's ready to eat spaghetti with the family and all of that. And that was it just hit this cultural, zeitgeist thing in such a huge way that 20 years later, there was a restaurant also in the North End called Polcari's. And so you got this guy, in the 80s, you got this guy in a leisure suit running through the streets of the North End of Boston. He's running, and it's Anthony, right? And so he gets to the, he finally, he comes to he ends up in front of Polcari's restaurant, and John Polcari, the owner, says to him, and it was kind of a posh restaurant. John Polcari says, "Hey, Anthony, where were you on Wednesday?" So there was there was some kind of role that these communities sort of played, and these kind of informal networks in these communities played, which probably has been, since then has been lost because the big dig happened, and now the North End is not a neighborhood that's on the other side of the highway and all of that.
So we don't interact with our immediate neighbour because they're not blood relative, no matter how distant, 3 or 4 cousins removed type thing. And as Chris says, if you don't actually interact, there's a level to where you have to trust them more without any basis for the trust. And if I remember rightly, sometime earlier this week, somebody drove into the wrong driveway and got shot because they were in the wrong driveway.
Yeah.
Whereas, why would you do that until you find out who they are or what they are? Or,
Yeah.
If it's just a knee-jerk reaction because that's not my son's car or that's not my brother's car, what's the next step? So community over and above clearly obvious family is a real issue, but given we were talking about particularly the religious right, there was a question: what are the two greatest commandments? You know, second one being love thy neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to choose your neighbor in that context. You might get to choose the God you wish to worship, but you don't necessarily get to choose your neighbor. And you know, there's a clear lack, but you also then get at the other extreme the likes of Steven Pinker saying there's less violence. Now, I don't know, since he wrote the book 5-6 years ago, whether that's still true. It's clearly not a feeling that we might all have. Yeah, I mean, so Anthony died of too much spaghetti, I presume.
Probably.
A couple of friends in Florida, I see it brought up, have actually put up the meme from the Sunshine State: freedom to carry concealed, but not the freedom not to carry to term. So again, it's the same part and parcel question, and it's the same mindset that says, I'll cherry pick Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Exodus to pick my stuff.
Well, and it probably does actually support Kathleen Bellu's thesis in that insurrection are in that chapter, that it is about white replacement or replacement of the white race, right? That's why because it doesn't take long for that debate to go on before somebody trots out the statistic that the people, that the fetuses, they call it the babies that are being aborted in America, are white babies. Those are the ones that we care about. So the people getting shot are sometimes also white people, but not the majority. And that seems to be.
And there was another number that came out sometime this year, I think it was, that gun crime, not just mass shootings, but gun crime in total, is now the number one killer in the US of the under 18s.
Mm-hmm.
As in, all the accidentals of 3-year-old shooting a 4-year-old as well, the whole range of gun crime. And of course, this year you've had, I think it was 160 odd mass shootings, so just over one day. That's like the last 20 years. It's not even. We don't even make that number for the last 20 years in the UK. We had 2 of significance, and they shut down the Turner Dari issue of taking away the guns. The 2 mass shootings. One was somebody just walked down the high street taking pot shots. Mm-hmm. That was in Newbury, I think it was, from memory. Wantage, Newbury, something like that. And the other one was a school in Scotland, which was a semi-copycat thing of you and your first big one at Stacey Village. So Dunblane in Scotland. So 2, literally 2, and it was like 3 weeks it took probably to get through both houses of Parliament. It was law, and everybody was surrendering their guns with an amnesty, whether you were registered or not. Because obviously we want them all. We don't want the registered ones.
Right. Yeah. Which did that was something that couldn't happen here. It's interesting. It's weird. Pat said it's interesting justice that the Mexicans are taking back Texas and California. It's also interesting, weird that, that I don't know why, I saw a clip of Ben Shapiro the other day arguing with somebody about the Second Amendment, and actually he was able to take the position that, that this liberal who he was arguing against, who was calling for a ban on assault weapons, wasn't giving adequate attention to the people who are being killed with handguns in Chicago. Don't you care about Black men in Chicago being killed with handguns? Why are you only focusing on, are you going to take handguns away? Or what, are you going to do this? And he kind of backed this guy, and again, rhetorically sort of backed this guy into a corner, because Ben Shapiro, I don't think, is in favor of taking handguns away from anybody and preventing, Black people from being shot in Chicago. But he was able to, to score that point. So, kind of back to that theme of argumentation. Was that the term that Mark used?
One of the other things that gets me too, having been to Tennessee and talked to some family members who, I watch more Fox News than is probably good for them, and some of it fits in with their worldview. But one in particular kept saying things like, Fox News is reporting on stories that none of the other big networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSN, CNN, all the rest, are touching.
Mm-hmm.
And why aren't they reporting on those things? And I said, there is some space in the middle. And if the reporting you're hearing isn't all the same, it doesn't need to be homogeneous, and you can have different stories.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't look at stories from 4 different outlets and find at least some overlap from like reasonable spaces, then what you're watching is more likely propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I turn around and I come back, and the biggest story of the week, I think, is Fox News, taking it on the head with this lawsuit from Dominion,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not only patently obvious from the research they got going into this that all the senior executives were saying, hey, this story is crazy, yet Fox News pushed it and covered it to the nth degree, to the point that they're giving up $750 million. But what's even worse is, for society and us as a country, Fox News is not reporting on themselves saying, hey, we just lost $760+ million because
Right.
we were lying to you all this time.
Yeah.
So all these people who are saying, hey, Fox is, they're covering things that are being missed by all the rest.
Right.
And it's like, well, yeah, it's being missed by them as well, because it's more propaganda and entertainment, or infotainment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't watch. I used to at least occasionally watch the 12 o'clock hour with Shep Shepherd to see what Fox's hard news looked like. But everything in the 7, 8, 9 o'clock slots are talking heads' opinion that's
Right.
presented as news and
Right.
presented as infotainment,
Yeah.
and loud, brash yelling. And that's where all their money and business is
Right.
coming from.
And Chris Wallace left, right, to go to CNN Now, or whatever the failed online CNN thing was. He didn't go back, did he?
I don't think so. And that's the thing too, is all the serious, legitimate news people have left, and it's all talking head infotainment and really just propaganda.
Yeah.
And when you look at what Rupert Murdoch's internal emails and internal executive emails and texts look like in this case, it was, yeah, we know this story is crazy pants, but we're going to keep telling it because it plays to our base and we're making money off of this.
Right.
So who cares?
Yeah. And his European-based papers have not reported it at all.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
No, nobody who's in the bubble probably knows that it happened. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. And apparently the My Pillow guy too, he probably considers his, that expense as a cost of doing business.
Or if they do know about it, it's framed as a witch hunt, and they're out to get not Fox is a company and a group of people, but they're out to get us,
Yeah.
our crowd, our community,
Right.
not
And
they're
those
out to
brave,
get this one mouth, bad actor.
and those brave journalists who speak for us and protect us. Yeah. And on that note, we probably should wrap this. So I just purchased Donut Economics, so I'll start listening and reading the introduction and the first chapter for next time. Last word on this book. I think it had some interesting things in it.
I think overall, actually, for us as a group, it was interesting to have a bunch of different topics every week.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't like a particular chapter, you skip it and move on, maybe. But
yeah.
But it also was an interesting, overarching theme to put a book together around.
Yeah.
So I learned a bunch of interesting things, and I particularly love the kind of more historical framing, because a lot of these topics are things that we see and hear about daily in the newspaper, but the newspaper articles or magazine articles never get deep enough into the weeds on the history where these things came from. So from that perspective, I really appreciated a lot more of that in this book,
Mm-hmm.
of the delving into those pieces that you just don't see, or hey, let's provide some additional context of where this stuff came from.
Yeah.
I've probably heard 20 people talking about the idea of the Democratic and the Republican parties switching,
Mm-hmm.
over the last 3 or 4 years.
Right.
It pops up regularly, but almost no outlet I saw ever really got into the depth of
The mechanics.
here's what happened and here's how it played out roughly, or at least in an outline form. You could probably do 3 or 4 books on just that topic alone, but
Oh, sure, yeah, but it is.
I love that perspective of that for this particular book.
Yeah, well, and I like that too. I like the idea that because I do sort of pursue that myself, kind of that goal of trying to contextualize the present with information from the past. So yeah.
Although I do kind of wish some of the chapters were as long as the editor's chapters were able to be.
Yes.
But I think at the same time too, if you're a professional historian whose approach to write something and here's your word limit, you're going to probably shoot to the lower end
Mhm.
of that thing too. So
well, and I think probably most of these people were asked to expand on something that they had already put on Medium or some other kind of.
The Erastices and Conway chapter is almost the introduction to their new book.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But for Naomi, she's done several sort of TED type lectures that mimic what she was talking about, although it wasn't quite as focused on them as this chapter was. And I like, as I said in the note, it's quite not so much the detail analysis per se, but the context for why, because I know there's a 25th Amendment, I think, but I don't even know if that's the biggest number one, and I don't know outside of a couple, like the second and the fifth, I don't know what they are, but I don't need to worry about it.
Right.
So the last chapter we looked at on the voting fraud thing was somewhat interesting. It's the fact that the argument that happened during Reconstruction is still going on. As in, we Americans, as in those people that are of Puritan background, who invaded a semi-empty country. Thank you very much to Spanish Catholics for bringing over all the diseases,
Right.
to give us empty space, etc., etc. Therefore,
It's
we'll
providential,
take it.
damn it.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, and it's like, and of course, the Chinese attempted to take over the US with COVID-19 is clearly a bad thing, as
Yeah.
opposed to do unto me as I did unto the previous guy,
Yeah.
type thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just the total level of hogwash come. But it's also interesting at the moment. Of course, we've got the big protest going on over the climate change over in Parliament Square,
Mhm.
with multiple people, and the coverage from the right-wing press is quite something to sit down and do some comparisons to.
Mm.
Up to and including the fact that obviously some of the members of XR and all the rest of it, a bit like Greta does, she goes to a lot of the big events. So they've found one member of XR that's got like a 5 years worth of sky points for 17,000 something miles. So all of a sudden, that's now hypocrisy, as opposed to who wrote the story,
Mm.
in which newspaper, and how much has the boss got in
Right.
his private jet type
Right.
equivalent. So, you know, it just goes on and on and on. Anyway,
Anyway,
as we've all got to go.
we gotta go. All right. So
Bye-bye.
see you next week.
Yeah, intro.
Intro and chapter 1. Yep. And the most recent amendment was the 27th, and it was about congressional compensation. See you later.
Okay. Cheers.